Okay, we're going to factor three terms by grouping. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to take my three terms, I'm going to force it into four terms. And the reason I'm going to force it into four terms is because if I have four terms, I can use factor by grouping. Okay, so the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to look at this polynomial right here, and I'm going to multiply its first coefficient and its last coefficient together. And when I do that, I'm going to get this 12 times -1 equals -12. So that's what I'm going to do. And then with that information, I'm going to find all the pairs of numbers that multiply to -12. And I'm going to start with just one. 1 times 12, -12, erase this. 1 times -12, that multiplies to -12. And -1 times 12, that multiplies to -12. 2 times -6, -2 times 6, 3 times -4, -3 times 4. Okay, so these are all the pairs of numbers that if I multiply them together, they would multiply to this -12 that I am trying to get to right here. Okay, now that I've done that, my goal is to take I'm going to unhighlight these guys. I'm going to take those pairs of numbers. I'm going to find one that I can use to substitute this guy right here. So what I want is I want what adds, I'm going to write this down, what adds to that middle number, to -4. So I can say, well, if I'm looking at these, I know that these add to -11, and these add to a +11. These add to, these add to -4, and these add to a +4. And this is going to add to a -1. And that's going to add to a +1. But my goal is to find the one that adds to this -4, and that's going to be this right here. This is the one that multiplies to the 12 that I'm looking for, -12 that I'm looking for, and adds to the -4. All right. I'm going to be able to use these two terms and replace this one term because my goal is to get a total of 4 terms. Okay, so I'm going to go through the logic. I'm going to go, I know that, I'll change this to red. So I know that 2 minus 6 equals -4. But my goal is to get it to be really this -4x. So that means that I really want I want a positive 2x and a -6x to add to a -4x. And that way, these things have the same value because 2 minus 6 is -4. So I can replace one term with two terms so that I have this total of 4 terms at the end. Okay, I'm not going to change any of this part. So I'm not changing this part. I'm not changing that part. I'm just going to write that part down again. I've got a 12x squared and I've got a -1. But I'm going to cross out this. I'm not using this. I'm going to use that instead. So I'm going to change it out with this positive 2x and minus 6x because that's equivalent to -4x. And I've officially taken my 3 terms and turned it into 4 terms, which means now I have the ability to factor by grouping. Okay. When I factor by grouping, I just want to break it into 2 parts. So I have my first part and my second part. And I want to treat them as if they're individual problems and just pull out the greatest common factor out of each of these little groups here. And so when I'm looking at this first group here, so I'm going to change this color and say when I'm looking at this guy right here, I want to know what divides into both of those terms. And I'm going to start out by saying the number that divides into both 12 and 2 is 2. And the least amount of x's is just a single x, so that's what's going to divide out of both of those. Okay, so I'm going to write that down. Here's my greatest common factor, and then I'm going to do the math and say, well, I'm going to say, what does 12x squared divided by 2x equal? And 12 divided by 2 is 6, and x squared divided by x is x. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this part, and 2x over 2x, it's the same thing on top as it is on bottom. Well, that's 1. Anything over itself, right? This cancels, it leaves me 1. This cancels, it leaves me 1. And 1 times 1 is 1. Okay. Now that I've done my first group, now I'm looking at this second group, and I want to figure out what divides out of both of those terms. And the number that divides out of both of these terms is 1, but I always want to use the sign of, I'm going to use purple, the sign of this third term. So I'm really dividing out a negative 1. So I'm going to write that down. I'm dividing out a negative 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the math on this guy right here and say a negative divided by a negative. Well, that's going to be a positive 6x. And then I'm going to do the math on this guy right here. Well, negative 1 divided by negative 1 is positive 1. Okay. Almost done. Now what I want to do is pull out the greatest common group. And the greatest common group is this 6x plus 1 and this 6x plus 1. So I'm pulling it out. But when I pull it out, I'm only taking it out once. Right? So I'm going to write this down, 6x plus 1, but I'm pulling this out only once because it's a greatest common group. Right? It's the same factor in both those terms. So I don't write that down twice, just once. Then what I'm looking for is what's left over. What didn't I pull out of this polynomial? And I'm going to unhighlight these and then highlight the things that are left over. Well, this is left over and that's left over, and I'm just going to write those down in parenthesis groups. And now I have completely factored my polynomial by grouping.